In January 1942, the Nazi regime quietly initiates the planned extermination of Europe's Jewish population at a villa in Berlin's Wannsee. This marks a shocking shift from isolated killings to a coordinated effort of mass murder. During this phase of the war, we observe how policy evolves into machinery. Reinhard Heydrich's Reich Security Head Administration establishes control following Hermann Göring's approval. Adolf Eichmann plays a crucial role as ghettos are transformed into holding areas. The rapid expansion of killing methods progresses from gas vans at Chełmno to fixed extermination sites at Bełżec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, all operating according to Reichsbahn schedules, despite the Wehrmacht's concerns over lost labor and rail resources. At the same time, the conflict has truly become a global affair since December 1941. Across Asia, Japanese occupation turns brutal in locations such as Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, marked by mass reprisal actions, the Bataan Death March, forced labor on the Burma Railway, and the system of comfort women. We also prepare for the first setbacks to Japanese advances in the Pacific in 1942, from the morale-boosting Doolittle raid to the carrier battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, which begin to alter the balance of power by June. Heinrich Himmler's dynamic deputy was SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, who led the Reich Security Head Administration, overseeing the expanding SS empire. Heydrich, tall, impeccably dressed, and a skilled violinist, was known for his intense anti-Semitism, rumored to have had some Jewish ancestry that only fueled his hatred further. By the summer of 1941, he grew frustrated with the haphazard approaches to the Jewish question and the absence of a centralized plan. In addition to the massacres conducted by local security officials in the Eastern Territories, some SS leaders began to experiment with more systematic forms of extermination. In Warthegau, ineffective trials were conducted in which exhaust fumes were funneled into sealed vans. In the general government, SS police leader Odilo Globoknik started constructing an extermination camp at Bec near Lublin. Meanwhile, Himmler was eager to address the psychological strain experienced by the Einsatzgruppen as a result of their actions. Heydrich had tasked Adolf Eichmann with drafting an authorization, which Göring signed on July 31st. The document directed Heydrich to take action, either through emigration or evacuation, to address the Jewish question, and tasked him with making all necessary organizational, functional, and material arrangements for a complete resolution of the Jewish issue within the German sphere of influence in Europe. About a month later, Eichmann was called into Heydrich's office, where he learned that Himmler had received orders from Adolf Hitler to carry out the physical extermination of the Jews. While senior Nazi officials sometimes invoked the Führer's name to push their agendas, it would have been unimaginable in this case for Himmler or Heydrich to do so on such a critical matter. Earlier notions that the total extermination of the Jews would only occur after a victory had been achieved were abandoned. There was a palpable, unexpressed concern that the opportunities presented by the war in the East should not be overlooked. Additionally, pressure mounted in Germany and occupied territories, including France, to send their Jewish populations eastward. In Paris, the SS instructed the French police to apprehend French and foreign Jews, leading to an initial operation on May 10, 1941, that deported 4,323 individuals to 2 holding camps. On September 18th, an order from Himmler indicated that the ghettos were now to serve as storage camps. More than 500,000 Jews had perished from starvation and disease in the Polish ghettos, but this was deemed far too slow of a process. Further discussions indicated that the plan was to confine all Jews to concentration camps. However, even in a totalitarian regime, there were legal challenges to address, such as how to handle Jews with foreign passports and what to do with those married to Aryans. On November 29, 1941, Heydrich invited senior officials from the Eastern Ministry and other agencies to meet with him and representatives from the Reich Security Main Office to discuss a unified policy. This meeting was scheduled for December 9th, but was delayed at the last minute. Marshal Zhukov's significant counteroffensive had been launched on December 5th, and 2 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Time was required to evaluate the consequences of these significant events, and then on December 11th, Hitler announced to the Reichstag his declaration of war against the United States. The following day, he called Nazi party leaders to a meeting at the Reich Chancellery. He referenced his prediction made on January 30th, 1939, stating that if a world war broke out, the instigators of the violent conflict would have to pay for it with their lives. With Hitler's announcement of war and Japan's assaults in the Far East, the conflict had truly escalated to a global scale. In Hitler's warped reasoning, the Jews had to bear the consequences of their supposed guilt. Goebbels noted in his diary on December 12th that the Führer was intent on making a decisive change. He warned the Jews that if they were to provoke another world war, it would lead to their own annihilation. This was not merely a figure of speech. The World War had arrived, and the destruction of Jewry was seen as a necessary outcome. This matter was to be approached without sentimentality. Just days later, Hitler convened a meeting with Himmler to address the Jewish issue. Yet, despite an intensified atmosphere where Hitler repeatedly returned to his pre-war assertion that the Jews were bringing about their own ruin, he still did not seem to have reached a final decision on a comprehensive plan. Even with his fervent rants against the Jews, he appeared to be notably hesitant to engage with the details of mass exterminations, much like he avoided imagery of suffering in battle or from bombings. His inclination to keep violence abstract revealed a significant psychological contradiction in someone who had driven it more than almost anyone else in history. After some delays, Heydrich's conference finally occurred on January 20th, 1942, in the offices of the Reich Security Main Office in a large villa by the shore of the Wannsee, situated on the southwestern edge of Berlin. SS Obergruppenführer Heydrich led the meeting, while SS Obersturmbannführer Eichmann took notes. In addition to other RSHA members, most attendees were senior representatives from the occupied territories, the Reich Chancellery, and 4 state secretaries, head officials of vital ministries. Among them was Dr. Roland Freisler of the Justice Ministry, who later gained infamy for his role in persecuting the July plotters. The Foreign Ministry was represented by Unterstaatssekretär Martin Luther, named after a much more famous and influential anti-Semite. He arrived equipped with a carefully prepared memorandum titled Requests and Ideas of the Foreign Ministry in Connection with the Intended Final Solution of the Jewish Question in Europe. Just over half of those present held doctoral degrees, and a significant number were lawyers. Heydrich asserted his authority to oversee the preparation for the final solution across all regions and official responsibilities. He shared statistics regarding Jewish communities throughout Europe, including British Jews, who would be relocated to the east. His estimated total amounted to 11 million. This number would be reduced through forced labor, and the remaining individuals would be dealt with as deemed necessary. Elderly Jews and those who had served in the German army would be sent to the show camp at Theresienstadt in Bohemia. Luther, representing the Foreign Ministry, recommended caution and a delay in the roundup of Jews in countries like Denmark and Norway, as this could provoke an international backlash. Much time was consumed debating the complex issue of individuals of partial Jewish heritage, known as Mischlinge, and those married to Aryans. Predictably, the representative of the general government called for prioritizing their own Jewish population. Finally, while enjoying brandy after lunch, the attendees discussed different methods to achieve their goals. However, the minutes captured typical euphemisms like evacuation and resettlement. One thing was evident to all present: ideas for a territorial solution had failed. Following Stalin's unpredictable general offensive after the Battle of Moscow, there was no viable location in the occupied Soviet territories to forcibly relocate Jews to die. The only clear solution now appeared to be systematic extermination. A sense of urgency to proceed with this task swept through the Nazi administration, especially in Frank's territory of the general government. Gauleiter Arthur Greiser aimed to eliminate 35,000 Poles suffering from tuberculosis in the Warthegau. SS lawyers even considered the possibility of killing German and other prisoners who happened to appear unacceptable. During the Shoah by bullets, The perpetrators in the occupied Soviet Union sought out their victims, while in the Shoah by gas, the victims were brought to their executioners. This process initially began in the extermination camps of Chełmno, where gas vans were employed, and continued in Bełżec, Treblinka, and Sobibor, before moving to Auschwitz-Birkenau in the summer. A powerful administrative system was established to manage the Jews who had not yet perished in the ghettos or been executed. Adolf Eichmann, tasked with rounding up all the Jewish populations outside Poland, collaborated closely with Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo. Eichmann, who also had a passion for the violin, engaged in weekly chess games with Müller while they contemplated their enormous responsibilities. The critical element of their operation was transportation. Careful planning and scheduling were essential. The Reichsbahn, employing 1.4 million individuals, was the largest organization in Germany after the armed forces and was quite profitable. Jews were transported in freight cars and cattle wagons, charged the same rate as fare-paying passengers for a one-way trip. The Reisen for the guards from the Ordnungspolizei were billed at return fare rates. The Gestapo funded this through Jewish assets. However, the ideological fixations of Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich often conflicted with the military objectives they were attempting to achieve. The Wehrmacht began raising concerns about the removal of skilled Jewish workers from the arms industry and the significant rerouting of rail transport at a time when resupply for the Eastern Front was crucial. Jewish community leaders were instructed to manage their own policing of the relocation, under the threat that if they failed to do so, the SA or the SS would take over, knowing full well what that meant in terms of violence. They were also required to create lists for the transports. Those sent to the Ostland faced execution upon arrival, primarily in Minsk, Kaunas, and Riga. Depending on where they were collected from, the majority were soon sent to extermination camps. The elderly and so-called privileged Jews who were sent to Theresienstadt were unaware that their eventual death sentence was only postponed. The Ordnungspolizei and Gestapo members involved in clearing the ghettos received a ration of brandy, while Ukrainian auxiliaries did not. Jews attempting to hide or escape were shot immediately, as were the elderly who couldn't board the transports unassisted. Most departed in the railway wagons, seemingly resigned to their fate. Nevertheless, a few managed to flee from the trains into the woods, with some receiving assistance from Polish individuals and others successfully joining partisan groups. Nazi concentration camps were established shortly after Adolf Hitler took power in 1933 to detain political opponents and served as a menace to anyone who might criticize the regime, both Gentile and Jewish. Heinrich Himmler organized one of the earliest camps for political prisoners at Dachau, located just north of Munich, and soon took control of the administration of all such facilities. The guards, known as the Death's Head units, derived their name from the skull badge they wore. In 1940, as the camp network rapidly expanded following the invasion of Poland, Oswald Pohl, a high-ranking official, developed his own sub-organization within the Schutzstaffel. He transformed labor camps into a source of income and became a crucial figure in the evolution of the camp system. Zyklon B was initially tested at Auschwitz in September 1941, but the first extermination camp with proper gas chambers, built under Pohl's leadership, was B. Construction commenced in November 1941, just 2 months prior to the Wannsee Conference. Other camps quickly followed suit. The operation of these extermination camps benefited significantly from the expertise of those involved in the euthanasia program overseen by the Reich Chancellery. Some have suggested that the mass extermination process mirrored the production line methods of Henry Ford, who in turn had drawn his ideas from the meatpacking plants in Chicago. Ford, known for his staunch anti-Semitism since 1920, was idolized by Hitler and other leading Nazis. There is speculation that he may have provided financial support to the Nazi Party, though no definitive proof exists. Still, his book, The International Jew, had been translated and published in Germany, where it greatly influenced Nazi ideology. Hitler kept a portrait of Ford in his Munich office and awarded him the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle in 1938. However, there is little substantial evidence to suggest that the Ford production techniques were replicated in the extermination camps. By the end of 1942, nearly 4 million Jews from Western and Central Europe and the Soviet Union, along with 40,000 Roma, would be murdered in these camps. The involvement of the Wehrmacht, officials from nearly every ministry, a significant portion of the industry, and the transportation system contributed to a collective guilt that German society took many years to confront after the war. The Nazi regime worked tirelessly to keep the extermination process hidden, yet countless individuals were involved. Heinrich Himmler, addressing senior SS officers in October 1943, referred to it as an unwritten and never-to-be-written page of glory in our history. Rumors spread quickly, especially after soldiers captured images of mass executions of Jews in the Soviet Union. Initially, many civilians found it hard to believe that Jews were being murdered through systematic gassing. However, a significant number of Germans were implicated in various stages of the final solution, and many were profiting from the seizure of Jewish property, including businesses and homes, leading a considerable minority to be well aware of the atrocities. While some sympathy had been expressed toward Jews when they were made to wear the yellow star, the situation shifted dramatically once deportations began, rendering Jews as non-persons in the eyes of their fellow citizens. Many Germans chose to ignore their plight, convincing themselves that ignorance was the reason, when in reality it was more akin to denial. As Ian Kershaw noted, the road to Auschwitz was built by hatred, but paved with indifference. Meanwhile, the infamous medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz by Dr. Josef Mengele and his team remained largely unknown to German civilians. The cruel experiments on Russian, Polish, Roma, Czech, Yugoslav, Dutch, and German political prisoners at Dachau were also relatively obscure. Over 12,000 individuals suffered and died from these horrendous tests, often in excruciating pain, which included injections with diseases, experiments on extreme high and low pressure, immersion in freezing water to simulate conditions faced by aircrew downed at sea, and feeding them salt water while subjecting them to liver puncture procedures. Additionally, prisoners in the autopsy room were forced by SS personnel to remove and treat quality skin from corpses, except for those of Germans, for the creation of items like saddles, riding breeches, gloves, house slippers, and women's handbags. At the Anatomical Medical Institute in Danzig, Professor Rudolf Spanner had Poles, Russians, and Uzbeks killed at the nearby Stutthof concentration camp, so he could experiment with recycling their bodies for soap and leather. A mindset like this in a doctor may be difficult for us to grasp, but as the traumatized Vasily Grossman noted after detailing the atrocities of Treblinka, it is the writer's responsibility to share this dreadful truth, and it is the duty of the reader to understand it. Despite the systematic industrialization of the final solution, the mass shootings persisted in both the Reichskommissariat Ostland and the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Even Jews who had been retained for their skills faced being rounded up and murdered. During the early spring and summer of 1942, the SS Einsatzgruppen and 9 regiments of Ordnungspolizei vied to eradicate all Jews in their territories through large-scale actions. In July, a German paymaster reported, "In Bereza Kartuska, where I took my midday break, 1,300 Jews were shot the day before. They were taken to a hollow outside the town. Men, women, and children were forced to completely undress and were executed with a shot to the back of the head. Their clothes were disinfected for reuse. I am convinced that if the war continues, Jews will be turned into sausage and fed to Russian prisoners of war or to qualified Jewish workers." One ghetto after another was surrounded. Some Jewish businessmen attempted to secure their survival through bribes. Jewish girls who wanted to save themselves offered themselves to policemen. Typically, the women were used at night and killed in the morning. The police and their auxiliaries moved in during the early hours or just before dawn, under the bright light of searchlights or flares. Many Jews sought refuge under floors, but the killers threw hand grenades underneath the shacks. In some instances, buildings were set ablaze. Those rounded up were taken to execution pits, where they were made to strip before being shot at the edge or forced to lie down in tight formations. Once again, the killers were struck by the Jews' submission. Many executioners were drunk and did not finish off their victims, leading to some being buried alive. A few even managed to dig their way out afterward. Not everyone was submissive. The forest Jews who had escaped the roundups either joined Soviet partisan groups or formed their own, particularly in Belarusia. Anti-partisan operations under the command of Bok-Selowski continued into the spring of 1944. In Lwów and across Galicia, the German security police and Ukrainian Hilfspolizei, known as HIPOS, persisted with their killings. Efforts to establish resistance groups in the ghettos were rarely successful until the desperate uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto in January 1943. There were attempts at resistance in the ghettos of Lwów and Białystok, but these efforts did not match the scale or determination seen in Warsaw. Those Jews who had previously been against resistance now understood the harsh reality. The Germans aimed to exterminate them all. Following the deportation of over 300,000 Jews during 1942, only 70,000 remained in the Warsaw Ghetto. Most of those left were young and relatively strong, as the sick and elderly had already been taken away. Various Jewish political factions, including Bundists, Communists, and Zionists, united to fight back. They first targeted collaborators and then began to set up defensive positions connected to the sewer system. They obtained weapons and explosives from the Home Army, which was loyal to the government in exile, and from the Polish communist resistance, known as the People's Guard. A few hundred pistols and revolvers were acquired from citizens in Warsaw who had managed to keep them concealed, despite the deadly risks. In January 1943, the first armed skirmish erupted when the Germans rounded up 6,500 Jews for deportation. An infuriated Heinrich Himmler ordered the complete annihilation of the Warsaw Ghetto. However, it was not until April 19th that a significant assault on the area occurred. Waffen-SS troops advanced from the northern end, where captives were loaded onto cattle trucks in the sidings. The attackers quickly retreated with their wounded after facing heavy fire and losing their only armored vehicle to a Molotov cocktail. Himmler was horrified upon learning of their defeat and dismissed the commander. From that point, the SS engaged in attacks with small raiding teams at various points. Following a futile defense of the factories, which the Germans set ablaze with flamethrowers, the Jewish defenders fell back into the sewers, emerging to fire on German troops from concealment. The SS attempted to flood them out by pumping in water, but the Jewish fighters were able to evade or redirect the deluge. Others had taken control of a large structure used by an armaments firm and mounted a defense of it. Brigade Führer Jürgen Stroop commanded his men to ignite the building. As Jews jumped from the upper floors, the SS troopers mockingly referred to them as parachutists and aimed to shoot them before they reached the ground. After the war, Stroop still seemed captivated by the conflict, sharing his experiences with a cellmate in prison. He recalled, "The uproar was extraordinary, with houses ablaze, billowing smoke, flames, flying sparks, feathers swirling in the air, the smell of charred bodies, booming guns, exploding grenades, the fiery glow, and Jews with their families jumping from windows and burning buildings." He acknowledged that the fierce determination of the Jews had completely surprised him and his men. The fierce resistance lasted nearly a month, concluding on May 16th. Thousands lost their lives in the fighting, and 7,000 out of 56,065 prisoners were executed on the spot. The rest were sent to Treblinka for gas chambers or to forced labor battalions where they faced brutal conditions. The ghetto was utterly destroyed. Vasily Grossman, who arrived in Warsaw with the Red Army in January 1945, vividly depicted the aftermath. Waves of stone, crushed bricks, a sea of brick. There isn't a single wall left standing. The fury of the beast was immense. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong initially began with aims of moderation, but quickly devolved into violence and chaos. While European victims faced relatively little suffering, intoxicated Japanese soldiers persistently raped and killed members of the local population, revealing the hypocrisy behind their slogan, "Asia for the Asians." The Japanese displayed some degree of respect for their fellow imperialists. the British, but showed no regard for other Asian races, particularly the Chinese. It is reported that a senior officer commanded the execution of 9 soldiers involved in the rape of British nurses at the hospital in Happy Valley. However, there were no actions taken to curb the violent exploitation of Chinese women. Looting was virtually unrestricted, both by Japanese soldiers and by the triads, along with supporters of the puppet Nanking regime led by Wang Qingwei, who acted as irregular police. In exchange, the military allowed the triads to establish gambling operations. Smaller criminal gangs also operated without fear of repercussions. The Japanese also made efforts to court the Indian community, inciting animosity towards the British while granting them a favored status with better food rations. Sikhs and Rajputs were recruited into the police and even armed. A strategy of division between the Indian and Chinese communities persisted until late 1942. This changed after a disagreement between the Japanese and the Indian Independence League in Singapore, leading to the sudden revocation of privileges for Indians. Consequently, their situation became worse than it had been under British rule. Under the oppressive authority of the Kempeitai military security police, even the Hong Kong Chinese, including members of the triads, began to yearn for British governance. The new Japanese governor aimed to win support from the Eurasians and influential Chinese merchant families to revive the port's economy. Simultaneously, senior Japanese officers, driven by the contents of the warehouses, initiated organized looting, motivated both by personal gain and the desire to secure war booty for Tokyo. As in many regions occupied by Japanese forces, tensions intensified due to rivalries between the Navy and the Army. The Army intended to utilize Hong Kong as a base to further their war efforts against Chiang Shek's nationalists, while the Navy sought to leverage the port for its southern expansion. On December 8, 1941, Shanghai fell swiftly to the Japanese and nominally came under the puppet government in Nanking led by Wang Qingwei. Within this bustling city of commerce, pervasive corruption, vice, and entertainment, life dramatically worsened for the remaining Europeans, the White Russian community, and particularly for the impoverished Chinese. A cholera outbreak claimed thousands of lives, food became scarce, and the black market thrived. Everything and nearly everyone was for sale. Shanghai turned into the espionage capital of the Far East, with the Abwehr and the Gestapo closely watching the Japanese, who reciprocated with their own surveillance. Japanese mistrust towards their German ally intensified significantly after the capture of the German communist spy Richard Sorge in October 1941. Yet, the Japanese occupation forces grappled with their own fierce rivalries. Competing intelligence agencies created a chaotic environment. In Singapore, on February 17, 1942, the Kempeitai military police targeted the Straits Chinese community. They faced punishment for their support of nationalist China during its resistance. General Yamashita mandated that the entire community pay $50 million as a form of reparation. Men aged 12 to 50 were at risk of execution, with many being taken, bound to Changi Beach, where they were shot. The Kempeitai admitted to executing at least 6,000 individuals for being labeled anti-Japanese, but the actual number was far greater, particularly when including executions on the mainland. Those categorized as such were often accused of being communists or former British servants. The Japanese also targeted individuals with tattoos, assuming they belonged to criminal groups. In the area around Changi Barracks, the stockpiles of barbed wire that the British intended to use for defenses were repurposed to confine Allied prisoners of war. These prisoners were compelled to line the streets for a victory parade celebrating General Yamashita, who became known as the Tiger of Malaya. Raffles Hotel was transformed into a brothel for high-ranking officers. The women there were either forcibly brought in from Korea or young Chinese girls taken from the streets. Most European women and male civilians were detained separately at Changi Jail, where 2,000 people were crammed into space meant for 600. Bribery was often the only option for prisoners to enhance their rations or secure medications. The polished rice they received lacked nutritional value, leading to rampant cases of beriberi among the increasingly malnourished British and Australian prisoners of war. Their guards included Koreans and anti-British Sikhs who had deserted during the fighting and then volunteered to work for the Japanese. With painful memories of the Amritsar massacre, they took pleasure in dominating their former rulers. Some adopted the Japanese practice of slapping faces if prisoners did not bow to their guards, and a few even participated as executioners for the Japanese. In Singapore City, looters and thieves faced execution, their severed heads displayed on poles as a grim warning. In the Far East, being buried without part of your body was deemed the worst possible fate. Many Malays had believed the Japanese propaganda that claimed the Imperial Army would liberate them and welcomed the troops with small rising sun flags. They quickly realized this was far from reality. Japanese opportunists and con artists flooded in, engaging in all sorts of shady enterprises, including dance halls, drugs, prostitution, and gambling. In the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese military authorities were infuriated to discover that most oil installations had been destroyed before surrender. The Dutch and other Europeans faced horrific retribution. In Borneo and Java, almost every white male civilian was either shot or decapitated, and many of their wives and daughters were subjected to gang rape. Dutch and Javanese women were compelled into comfort houses and assigned a daily quota of 20 enlisted men in the morning, 2 non-commissioned officers in the afternoon, and senior officers at night. If these young women, forced into this situation, attempted to escape or failed to comply, they faced severe punishment, and their families would suffer consequences as well. Overall, it is estimated that the Imperial Japanese Army coerced up to 100,000 girls and young women into sexual slavery. A significant number were Korean and sent to Japanese garrisons across the Pacific and in the South China Sea, but women of Malay, Straits Chinese, Filipino, Javanese, and other nationalities were also taken by the Kempeitai. This practice of exploiting the women from conquered countries to serve soldiers received clear approval from the highest levels of the Japanese government. A young nationalist named Ahmed Sukarno worked as a propagandist and advisor to the Japanese military, hoping they would grant independence to the former Dutch colony. After the war, instead of facing accusations of collaboration, he became Indonesia's first president, despite the reality that tens of thousands of his fellow citizens had endured starvation. It is estimated that around 5 million people in Southeast Asia died due to the Japanese occupation during the war, with at least 1 million of them being Vietnamese. Rice paddies were forcibly transformed into other crops for the Japanese, and rice and grain were confiscated to produce fuel alcohol. Political parties and a free press were prohibited. The Kempeitai utilized ruthless and primitive torture methods to punish any form of dissent or even the slightest hint of anti-Japanese sentiment. In a campaign of Nipponization, the Japanese language and calendar were enforced in some areas. Occupied nations were stripped of food and raw materials, leading to soaring unemployment, which caused the so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere to be mockingly referred to as the co-poverty sphere. The Japanese occupation currency became a source of ridicule as inflation spiraled out of control. In Burma, many Burmese initially welcomed the Japanese, hoping for independence, although the ethnically diverse tribes in the north remained loyal to the British. The Japanese assembled a force of nearly 30,000 to serve in their Burmese National Army, yet they were treated as inferior. Even Burmese officers were required to salute Japanese privates. Additionally, about 7,000 Indians captured in Malaya and Singapore were recruited for the Indian National Army, which was supposedly intended to help liberate their homeland from British colonial rule. British and Australian prisoners of war in Singapore were sent north to work on the notorious Burma Railway, regardless of their sickness, weakness, or emaciation. They suffered from various ailments including blackwater fever, beriberi, dysentery, diphtheria, dengue fever, malaria, and pellagra. No medical supplies were provided, and when flesh was torn by thorns while clearing jungle, wound infections set in rapidly. Prisoners had to bow not only to officers, but also to private soldiers. They faced slaps to their faces or beatings with the flat of a sword from non-commissioned officers or officers. Insubordination or dissent was met with a favored form of torture. After being force-fed water to the point of discomfort, a guard would stake the prisoner out on the ground and jump on their stomach. Any prisoner recaptured after an escape attempt often faced a public beheading. Japanese guards shouted "Speedo! Speedo!" at the weary captives, whipping them to increase their pace. Starved, thirsty, and plagued by insect bites, the prisoners of war labored almost naked in unbearable heat. Many collapsed due to dehydration. Ultimately, 1/3 of the 46,000 Allied prisoners of war perished, but the situation was even more dire for the 150,000 local forced laborers, of whom around half lost their lives. The Japanese occupation of French Indochina saw little change after the initial agreement with Admiral Darlan signed at Vichy on July 29, 1941. A further agreement regarding the defense of Indochina was formalized by Governor-General Admiral Jean Decoux in December, and the French administration that recognized Vichy remained until March 1945. The primary difference was that with Indochina effectively severed from France, the region fell under Japanese economic influence. Some nationalist factions allied with the Japanese hoping to gain independence from France, but the Japanese commander ensured the continuation of the French colonial regime. Meanwhile, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was resolute that Indochina should not revert to French control after the war. On April 9, 1942, just before Major General Edward King Jr. surrendered the American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula, he asked Colonel Nakayama Motu if his men would be treated well. Nakayama replied that they were not barbarians. However, Japanese officers had not anticipated capturing so many prisoners on Bataan. From the moment they enlisted, they were indoctrinated with the Bushido Code, which taught that a soldier never surrenders, leading them to view any enemy who did as unworthy of respect. Ironically, their anger was even greater towards enemies who had fiercely defended themselves. Of the 76,000 Americans and Filipinos, at least 6,000 were too sick or wounded to walk. Already filthy, emaciated, and exhausted from prolonged fighting while on starvation rations, around 70,000 men were forced forward on the 100-kilometer march to Camp O'Donnell. The Bataan Death March starkly contradicted Nakayama's assurances. Beaten and robbed of everything they owned, tormented by thirst and deprived of food, and prodded along by jabs from bayonets, the prisoners endured deliberate cruelty meant to exact revenge and inflict humiliation. In the following days, few guards allowed them to rest in the shade or lie down. Over 7,000 American and Filipino soldiers from Bataan perished. About 400 Filipino officers and non-commissioned officers from the 91st Division were killed with swords during a massacre on April 12th at Batanga. Among the 63,000 who arrived alive at the camp, hundreds more died each day. Additionally, 2,000 survivors from Corregidor succumbed to hunger or disease within their first 2 months of captivity. The series of disasters, surrenders, and humiliations faced by the Allies drew scorn from the Chinese nationalists, who had been resisting much larger Japanese armies for 4 years. The British declined to seek their assistance in defending Hong Kong and failed to arm the Chinese or allow them to defend themselves, which significantly weakened their claim to the colony in the event of a victory over the Japanese. The Chungking government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was firmly against a foreign presence in the treaty ports. The administration of President Franklin Roosevelt expressed strong sympathy for such anti-colonial views, and American public sentiment supported the notion that the United States should not aid in restoring British, French, and Dutch territories in the Far East. The British inability to resist the Japanese was mainly attributed to their colonial attitude. While this explanation might have been appealing at the time, it does not capture the full story. A significant portion of the nation's war resources had to be directed elsewhere. In early 1942, the British government faced pressure from Washington and Chungking to abandon Hong Kong, but later that year, London decided to only discuss the handover after the war concluded. The nationalists, believing their forces would be the first to enter the city, did not pursue the issue further. Chiang Kai-shek thought that since Britain had lost prominence in the Far East, nationalist China should gain recognition as a major power. President Franklin Roosevelt was inclined to agree, but he was aware that Joseph Stalin would not approve of China becoming a member of the Big Three. Furthermore, Chiang understood that despite his opinions about the British, he would require support from Winston Churchill, explaining his willingness to delay discussions regarding Hong Kong. Conversely, the nationalists were outraged that Britain's Special Operations Executive was collaborating with Chinese communist guerrillas in southern China, particularly along the East River and in the new territories of Hong Kong. The communists assisted British prisoners of war who fled the colony, even hosting a feast with goose and rice wine around a fire, where an officer taught the communist guerrillas to sing the British Grenadiers and the Eton boating song. Meanwhile, in India, the relationship between the British and the Congress Party, which sought independence for the country, had significantly worsened. Lord Linlithgow, the viceroy, demonstrated both arrogance and incompetence, politically and economically. In 1939, he failed to consult with Congress Party leaders or seek their support for the war effort. Churchill was equally problematic, with his romanticized views of empire and British rule in India. He was reluctantly forced to send a mission to India led by Sir Stafford Cripps, whom he favored least, and he despised the notion of granting dominion status to India after the war. Mahatma Gandhi famously referred to the proposal as a post-dated check, and Congress leaders were left unimpressed. On August 8, 1942, inspired by Gandhi, Congress issued a call for the British to quit India immediately, while insisting that British troops remain for defense against the Japanese. The following morning, British authorities arrested its leaders. Demonstrations and riots erupted, resulting in the deaths of 1,000 people and the imprisonment of 100,000. These disturbances reinforced Winston Churchill's belief that the Indians were ungrateful and treacherous. The loss of Burma to the Japanese in the spring of 1942 reduced India's rice supplies by 15%, causing prices to soar. Traders and merchants, seeking to profit further, hoarded supplies, leading to an inflationary spiral. The impoverished population found it increasingly difficult to afford food. The government in New Delhi did not intervene to regulate the rampant black market, instead shifting responsibility to regional administrations that reacted with extreme provincial protectionism. Regions like Madras, which had surpluses, refused to sell to those experiencing severe grain shortages. Bengal suffered the most from this growing crisis. At least 1.5 million people died directly due to the famine that began at the end of 1942 and continued throughout the following year. An estimated similar number succumbed to diseases such as cholera, malaria, and smallpox, weakened by malnutrition. Churchill, already angered by India, declined to alter the shipping program meant for relief efforts. It was not until Field Marshal Wavell became viceroy in September 1943 that the government of India began to address the food distribution crisis, using troops to manage food reserves. Wavell's actions further displeased Churchill as he pursued this course of action. This entire situation stands as one of the most disgraceful episodes in the history of British rule in India. Above all, it fundamentally countered the imperialist claim that British governance protected the poor from the wealthy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought one sliver of relief for the Americans. Their battleships, not their aircraft carriers, were docked that fateful weekend. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a forward-thinking Japanese commander, did not join in the celebrations after the attack for this very reason. In Washington, confusion clouded the offices of the main Navy building. The desire for retaliation was strong, but the severely weakened Pacific Fleet needed to be careful. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, the newly appointed commander-in-chief, was notoriously irritable. He was furious that the British had convinced General George Marshall and President Franklin D. Roosevelt to implement the Germany First strategy, which forced the Pacific Theater into a defensive position. British officers were convinced that King had an aversion to Anglo-Saxons, but their American colleagues assured them that Admiral King was not biased. He simply had a disdain for everyone. The naval leadership in Washington decided it was too risky to send a carrier task force to assist Wake Island. The 3 task force commanders felt deep frustration over this decision, yet it was likely the correct choice given the circumstances. In late December 1941, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor to assume the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Kimmel remained there, anxious about his future, though he received sincere support from his peers. At the highest levels of the United States Navy, rivalries and inflated egos were surprisingly minimal. Nimitz was an excellent selection for the position. A white-haired Texan with roots in impoverished German nobility, he had a calm demeanor, was decisive, and was capable of motivating people with gentle authority. Naturally, he inspired a deep sense of loyalty and trust. This was especially beneficial at a time when Washington had not yet formulated a clear strategy for the war in the Pacific. Nonetheless, Washington insisted on launching a raid on Tokyo to boost morale. This mission would be led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle of the Army Air Corps, utilizing B-25 medium bombers that would take off from a carrier for the first time. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey embarked on 8 April 1942 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Halsey embraced the opportunity to retaliate, but Nimitz had reservations about an operation that risked so many bombers for an action that would result in minimal damage to the enemy. He was also worried about having enough resources to counter the upcoming Japanese offensive, anticipated to occur around the Solomon Islands in New Guinea, part of the southwestern Pacific region under General MacArthur's command. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head cryptanalyst at Pearl Harbor, had helped break the Japanese Naval Code in 1940. An unconventional figure, often seen in carpet slippers and a red smoking jacket, Rochefort had been unable to alert anyone about the Pearl Harbor attack due to the strict radio silence maintained by the Japanese carrier fleet. Fortunately for the United States Navy, Rochefort had since managed to decode a signal indicating that the Japanese planned to land on the southeastern coast of New Guinea in May and capture the airfield at Port Moresby. This allowed their air force to dominate the Coral Sea and launch attacks on northern Australia at will. The vast distances of the Pacific made refueling at sea a significant challenge for both sides. Each United States task force, consisting of 2 carriers and escort vessels, had to operate with at least 1 tanker, which Japanese submarines targeted first. However, as the conflict continued, United States Navy submarines emerged as the most effective means of destroying Japanese freighters and tankers. In fact, United States submarines accounted for 55% of all Japanese vessels sunk, severely impacting their naval and land forces that were already running low on fuel and supplies. Halsey, who had just returned from the successful Tokyo raid, was the clear choice to lead this initial major counteroffensive. On April 30th, 1942, he set sail with Task Force 16. Yet, as Nimitz anticipated, Task Force 17, led by Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, which was already engaged in the Coral Sea, would carry the brunt of the fighting before Halsey could arrive. On May 3rd, a Japanese force landed on Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese commanders were overly confident that they would defeat any American naval force in the Coral Sea south of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Fletcher, aided by Australian and New Zealand warships, moved northwest upon learning that another Japanese force was advancing toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. Confusion ensued on both sides, but aircraft from the USS Lexington spotted the Japanese carrier Shohu and sank her. Japanese aircraft mistakenly believed they had located the American carrier force, sinking a destroyer and a tanker instead. On May 8th, both American and Japanese carriers launched attacks against each other. Yorktown's aircraft inflicted enough damage on the Shokaku to prevent her from launching more planes, while the Japanese successfully struck both the Lexington and the Yorktown. Unable to safeguard their invasion fleet, the Japanese opted to withdraw from Port Moresby, much to Admiral Yamamoto's frustration. The Lexington, which had appeared to stabilize, ultimately began to sink after explosions from leaking fuel. The battle in the Coral Sea was viewed as a partial success for the Americans, since it thwarted a landing, while the Japanese believed they had dealt their enemy a significant blow. Regardless, it led to considerable reflection among American forces regarding technical shortcomings in their aircraft and armaments, many of which remained unaddressed by the time of the next confrontation. Admiral Yamamoto understood that the United States could produce aircraft carriers faster than Japan could, so he sought to deliver a decisive strike before his fleet lost momentum. An assault on Midway Island would compel the few American carriers to engage in combat. Following the Doolittle raid on Japan, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo began to align with his perspective. Signals interceptions analyzed by Commander Rochefort and his team indicated that the Japanese fleet was preparing to head west and north to assault the Midway Islands. This suggested a desire to establish a base for an attack on Pearl Harbor itself. The naval staff in Washington dismissed this notion, but Nimitz ordered all available warships to return to Pearl Harbor as quickly as possible. By May 26th, when the main Japanese invasion fleet departed from Saipan in the Marianas, its target was clear. Rochefort had cleverly set a signals trap, dispatching a message stating that Midway was low on water. This was echoed in a Japanese message on May 20th, which identified Midway using the code AF. Since previous references with this code had indicated their primary objective, Nimitz now fully understood Yamamoto's overarching strategy. This knowledge provided a chance to avoid the significant trap ahead and turn the situation to his advantage. Meanwhile, Halsey was suffering from a stress-related ailment and had to be hospitalized. Nimitz appointed Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, known for his commitment to fitness, to lead Task Force 16. On May 28th, Spruance departed from Pearl Harbor with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, supported by 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Fletcher, who was to oversee the overall command, set out 2 days later with 2 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and the Yorktown, which had been repaired remarkably quickly. The American warships left just in time. A group of Japanese submarines, poised to ambush them, took positions between Hawaii and Midway only hours after the 2 task forces had passed. Spruance and Fletcher faced a daunting challenge. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 4 fleets at sea, comprising 11 battleships, 8 carriers, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 20 submarines. 3 task forces were en route to Midway, while one was heading for the Aleutian Islands, located approximately 3,200 kilometers to the north at the southern edge of the Bering Sea. The Japanese were confident that the Americans remained unaware of their plans. On June 3rd, aircraft stationed at Midway were the first to spot Japanese ships coming in from the southwest. The following day, the Japanese initiated their initial airstrikes on Midway. In response, bombers from the United States Army Air Forces and Marine dive bombers launched their counterattacks, suffering heavy losses and failing to achieve significant hits, which only boosted Japanese overconfidence. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the Japanese task force, remained unaware of the American carrier's presence. Meanwhile, Yamamoto began to suspect their existence after receiving a warning from Tokyo about increased radio transmissions from Pearl Harbor, but he preferred to maintain radio silence. For the young American pilots flying over the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, the anticipation of battle was both thrilling and frightening. Many of these pilots had just graduated from flight school and lacked the experience of their adversaries, yet they exhibited remarkable bravery. Being shot down over the ocean was bad enough, but being captured by a Japanese warship almost guaranteed beheading. The Japanese Zero fighter had the advantage over the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, but the Wildcat could withstand considerable damage due to its self-sealing fuel tanks. American torpedo bombers and dive bombers were at a disadvantage against the Zeros unless protected by fighter escorts. The outdated Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was slow, and its torpedo rarely functioned correctly, making an attack on a Japanese warship virtually a suicide mission for its pilot. In contrast, the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber proved to be much more effective, particularly during steep dives. A Catalina flying boat identified the location of the Japanese carrier group and relayed the information back. Fletcher instructed Spruance to gather his aircraft for an assault. Spruance's task force increased to full speed. Their targets were at the edge of the range for his torpedo bombers. Yet the potential rewards were worthwhile if they could strike the Japanese carriers just before they launched their own planes. Due to miscommunication, the Devastator torpedo bombers arrived first and without fighter protection. suffering heavy losses from the Zero fighters. The Japanese believed they had secured a victory, but their excitement was short-lived. Fuchida Mitsuo, the naval air commander, noted that service crews welcomed the returning pilots with cheers and words of encouragement aboard the Akagi. Planes were rearmed, and others were hoisted from the hangar to the flight deck, preparing for a counterstrike against the United States carriers. Admiral Nagumo chose to wait until the Nakajima torpedo bombers were equipped with ground attack bombs for another assault on Midway. Some historians argue that this caused a crucial delay and was unnecessary, while others emphasize that it was common practice to wait until all types of aircraft were ready to take off together. At 10:20, Admiral Nagumo ordered to launch when ready, Fuchida shared. On Akagi's flight deck, all planes lined up with engines warming. The massive ship began to turn into the wind, and within 5 minutes, all her planes were set to launch. At 10:24, the launch order came from the bridge through a voice tube. The air officer waved a white flag, and the first Zero fighter picked up speed and zoomed off the deck. In that moment, a lookout shouted, "Hell divers!" Looking up, I saw 3 dark enemy planes diving towards our ship. Some of our machine guns managed a few desperate shots, but it was too late. The distinctive shapes of the American Dauntless dive bombers grew larger, followed by black objects dropping eerily from their wings. The Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Fletcher's Yorktown had hidden in clouds at 3,000 meters, achieving complete surprise, and the flight deck of the Akagi was the perfect target. Fully fueled and armed aircraft began to explode one after another. One bomb created a massive hole in the flight deck, while another struck the elevator that raised aircraft from the hangar below. Although these impacts alone would not have sunk the ship, the fiery chaos from the exploding planes and the nearby stacked torpedoes turned the Akagi into a burning wreck. The portrait of the Emperor on board was quickly transferred to a destroyer. Nearby, the Kaga was also grievously damaged, with thick black smoke rising into the sky. American dive bombers then targeted the Soryu. Gasoline ignited, causing a conflagration. Ammunition and bombs started to detonate. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion tossed those on deck into the water. As soon as the fires broke out aboard the ship, Admiral Nagumo recounted, Captain Yanagimoto Ryusaku appeared on the signal tower to the starboard of the bridge. He took command of his position and urged his men to find shelter and safety. He would not allow anyone to approach him. Surrounded by flames, he refused to abandon his post. He was repeatedly shouting "Banzai" when he met his heroic end. Shortly after, the Yorktown was severely damaged by Japanese torpedo bombers. The returning aircraft were redirected to the carriers of Spruance, compensating for earlier losses. In a later attack, planes from the Enterprise struck the Hiryu, which also sank. Admiral Nagumo reported at 11:50 p.m. that Captain Kaki Tomeo and Squadron Commander Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon delivered messages to the crew. This was followed by expressions of reverence and respect to the Emperor, shouts of "Banzai," and the lowering of the battle flag and command flag. At 12:15 a.m., all personnel were ordered to abandon ship. His Imperial Highness's portrait was removed, and the transfer of crew to the destroyers Kazagumo and Makigumo began. This transfer was completed by 1:30 a.m. After finishing the transfer operations, the division commander and captain stayed aboard the ship. They waved their caps to their men and calmly accepted their fate alongside their ship. Yamamoto, unaware of the catastrophe that had struck his carriers, commanded further attacks. One can only imagine his reaction when he learned of the true circumstances. He ordered his massive fleet of 10 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest warship in existence, along with 2 escort carriers and numerous cruiser and destroyer escorts to engage at full speed. Spruance, knowing Yamamoto's forces were nearby, altered course during the night, heading back toward Midway to take advantage of land-based air cover. The next day, his dive bombers sunk one cruiser and severely damaged another. However, the damaged Yorktown, while salvage operations were underway on June 6th, was hit by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine and sank the following morning. With 4 Japanese carriers and a cruiser sunk, a battleship heavily damaged, and 250 aircraft destroyed, all for the loss of 1 American carrier, Midway marked a decisive victory and a clear turning point in the Pacific War. Yamamoto's dreams of destroying the United States Pacific Fleet were completely shattered. Nimitz acknowledged in his report that if we had not received early intelligence about the Japanese movement, and if our carrier task forces had been scattered, potentially as distant as the Coral Sea, the outcome of the Battle of Midway would have been significantly different.